China's finance ministry saying it will impose additional tariffs now on U.S. goods. That's going to start on April 10th at a rate of 34%. As you see what's taking place with these tariffs, do you anticipate the market to turn around, or is this a falling knife that continues to fall?
Well, first, I want to pick up on what you said, Andrew, about the Smoot-Hawley tariff. I think this is the biggest policy mistake in 95 years. If you go to Senate.gov and look up tariffs, this is what they say. It was on June 13th, 1930, that the Senate passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff, describing it as among the most catastrophic acts in congressional history. Now, this is the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate. And it said, despite the fact that 1,000 economists wrote a letter to Hoover saying, veto it, he did not veto it. And then it goes on saying the results were, and to use their words, disastrous. So disastrous that the American public voted the Republicans out of the House, the Senate, and the presidency 2 years later. Now, to be fair, the Fed screwed up badly afterwards as the economy sunk as a result of this. And they're not going to do that again because they've learned that lesson. I don't know why Trump didn't learn the lesson of the Smoot-Hawley tariff, because I know the Fed learned the lesson of its mistakes in 1930, 31, and 32. That's one reason why the great financial crisis did not turn into a Great Depression. We flooded the banks with liquidity, which we did not do 95 years ago. You know, Joe described it as a self-inflicted wound. Unforced error, like, did not have to happen. Supply shock. Powell himself said at the March FOMC meeting, you know, we're going to see through the inflation impact of this. At first, I thought there was no chance of a May cut in rates. Now I think that chance has been increased dramatically.
As you're speaking, we should now note the Dow has continued to tumble. We're now down close to 1,000 points on the Dow, and that's picked up steam. That was about half of what it was almost literally 15 minutes ago. The Chinese finance minister making these comments about retaliation. I think the question, therefore, becomes the following. If, in fact, you think the Fed is going to try to mitigate what has turned out, or at least thus far looks like a man-made conundrum, or whatever we're going to call it, do you want to own this market? Or do you think that right now, given everything that's going on, it still has a lot more to go if, in fact, this is going to continue this way? Do you want to be in this market, or do you say everything's now on sale?
If you're a long-term investor, you're staying in the market. I'm staying in the market. If you're a trader, there are storms ahead as long as these tariffs remain. You know, trade is a much more important part of the global economy than it was 95 years ago when the Smoot-Hawley tariff was put on. So the implications are potentially a lot worse. So short run, very stormy. If you're a market timer, which I don't advocate, as we all know, 95% of non-market timers do very badly. You know, you keep your powder dry. If you're a long-term investor, you know, these tariffs are not going to be forever by any means. There will be brighter days, to be sure.
How do you start to even measure something like a potential paradigm shift, like the tariffs that were announced earlier this week?
This is the biggest change in the environment that I've seen probably in my career. You know, we've gone from free trade or world trade and globalization to this system which implies significant restrictions on trade in every direction, and a step toward isolation for the United States. I believe that the last 80 years since World War II have been the best economic period in the history of mankind, and one of the major reasons was the growth of trade. And I think that we have truly had a rising tide that lifted all boats, and trade was a big part of that. And everybody in the audience should understand the role of trade. Every country, for example, does some things better and worse. And worldwide welfare is maximized when every country does the things it does best and cheapest, and then sells them to the countries that need them, which do other things and sell them to other people. That's how trade works. And, well, I don't know if it's politically correct, but the good news is that the Italians make the pasta and the Swiss make the watches. But if we stop world trade and the Swiss have to make their own pasta and the Italians have to make their own watches, the world will probably be, well, maybe arguably people in both countries will be a little worse off. And among other things, there was a 25-year period, which I cited in one of my memos 10 years ago, in which the cost of durables in the U.S. went down by 40% in inflation-adjusted terms. That kept a lid on inflation here. It made goods available cheaply to all Americans. If we don't have world trade, we don't have that benefit. And, you know, the tariffs are designed to encourage production at home, but who could imagine that most things produced in the United States will be as cheap as they are coming from abroad? In other words, things will cost more. Tariffs are an increased cost. Somebody has to pay them.
How do you understand where there's value, what a return is that would justify a risk at a time when, you know, potentially you could get 7%, 8%, 9% with credit? With stocks, they have delivered more than 10% for the past number of decades. But going forward?
Stocks have delivered an average of 10% a year for the last 100 years, but not when the PE ratio was 19. And the PE ratio today is probably 19. The average return has been 16. So we can say that when the PE ratio averages 16, the return averages 10. My guess is, if you look at history, if you bought the S&P when the PE ratio was 19, historically you probably made, let's say, 1 to 6% a year, or 2 to 7% a year, something like that, but certainly not 10. And so, you know, what you pay matters, and the price of the S&P is elevated relative to historic levels, so you shouldn't expect historic returns.
You've thrived during your 5-decade career, almost 5-decade career, during times of dislocation. Is this a time of dislocation to play or not to?
There's no place you can look. There's no analysis you can do to determine whether today's asset prices are right for the environment ahead. It's excessively hard today because today we have no idea what the future is going to be. Normally, we think we know what's going to happen in the future. We normally assume the future will look mostly like the past. We extrapolate. And usually it works because the world doesn't change that much. But the world economy and the world order beyond economy, meaning geopolitics and international relationships, has been shook up like a snow globe by the events of the last days. And nobody knows what it's going to look like. And so, you know, I always inveigh against forecasting. I don't believe in macro forecasting, my own or other people's. And we know much less today than usual. Now, people who like to run their lives according to forecasts, they say, well, this is going to happen in the future, so I'm going to do this, and this is going to happen in the future, so I'm going to do that. What you really need, if you like to work with forecasts, is you need two things. Not just a forecast. You need the forecast, but you need an estimate of the probability that your forecast is correct. And today, whatever your forecast may be, you have to say, the probability that I'm right is lower than ever, because the probability that we know what the future is going to look like is lower than ever. And that's how I feel.
Is this a time to be fearful or greedy?
You know, what you have to say, Bloomberg's offices, you have to think in terms of your neighbor. the department store.
Bloomingdale's.
Bloomingdale's just put everything on sale. Prices have come down for the S&P 8% in the last 2 days, and much more in the last 6 weeks. It's on sale. That should encourage people to think about buying. Will they go down further? Nobody knows. Are the prices fair? Nobody knows. But everybody runs from the market when prices go down because they think it connotes risk. It's just stuff going on sale. And, of course, it takes, well, I was going to say a pro, but it takes a prescient pro, of which there aren't many, to know whether, as I keep saying, the discounts are adequate or appropriate. But certainly you have to look.
Do you still think that the U.S. is the best place to invest?
I think it's probably still the best place, but it's less best than it used to be, because I think that, if you think about the things that made it the best place, one of them was the rule of law. That may be less the fact today. One of them was the predictability of outcomes. That may be less today. One of them was the worst thing about investing in the United States for many years has been our fiscal situation, our deficits and debts. And the U.S. has behaved like somebody who has a golden credit card where there's no credit limit and the bill never comes. So, of course, you can spend more than you make. And that's, and if somebody has a golden credit card, well, what would you do? Well, you might buy a nice car, but what the hell? You might as well buy all the cars because the bill's not going to come. And that's the way we've behaved. And that's the way Washington has spent money. But can the events of the recent days change that? Can they cause there to be a credit limit? Can they cause a bill to be presented at some point in time? And if the answer to either or both of those questions is yes, that's a real risk. If people don't like the dollar, don't like investing in the United States, don't want to hold an unlimited number of treasuries, if we just make people mad and say, the U.S. is still a great credit, but I don't want to hold their debts because look how they're treating me, the fiscal situation will be very complicated.